It's time for the news, y'all. It's time for the news. I said it's time for the news, y'all. It's time for the news. Time for the news, y'all. Time for the news.
That's right, it's time for the news, y'all. That's right, time for the news. And I'm gonna dive in here with these. Got a lot of charts here. I'm gonna put up one chart anyway to show how economic progress has stalled for Black Americans since the Civil Rights era. I mean, it has actually stalled, man. It's just stagnant and it hasn't changed not one bit, man, on an overall average since the 60s. The typical Black family is virtually no closer to an equal footing with its white peers in terms of income and wealth than it was 50 years ago when the Civil Rights era reforms were enacted to expand opportunity and limit outright racial discrimination. Like protests in the 1960s, the recent waves of rallies following Black Americans' deaths at the hands of police have renewed attention to the long-standing racial divide in the United States. Over the last half century, I would say that for many indicators, things have stagnated. The wealth gap, the income gap, and the earnings gap. White families continue to far outpace Black families in wealth. A typical Black household had less than 1/10 the net worth of a typical white household in both 1968 and 2016. So it's basically the same. A typical Black household has less than 1/10 the wealth of a typical white family, among the exact same ratio as existed in the 1960s, according to analysts by Moritz Kuhn, an economics professor at the University of Bonn in Germany. Lower home ownership rates among Black Americans, as well as smaller incomes and inheritances, account for much of the difference. The wealth chasm narrowed somewhat in the intervening years until the financial crisis just over a decade ago. More Blacks became homeowners, but factors such as continued residential segregation meant that the value of their housing and their net worth did not grow as much as it did for white homeowners. Also, Black families tended to have higher levels of mortgage debt. The mortgage crisis that triggered that economic collapse reversed those gains. Home ownership rates among Blacks plummeted from nearly 50% in 2004 to the low 40% range in recent years, a level not seen since the 1960s, according to the Urban Institute. Congress enacted the Fair Housing Act in 1968 with the goal of prohibiting racial discrimination. They were slammed a lot harder than white families by the house price collapse. Lower incomes plus a credit crunch means that they were left out of the housing market even after 2010. The income gap between Black families and white families is almost the same as it was in 1968. So that means that the median income in 2016 for the average white person, this is just average, is $58,000, and the average Black person was $33,000. That's income. That's so that's your income gap. The median income for households grew from the 1960s to the 1970s, and I've been telling people about that golden era from the 60s to the 70s for Black folks, when Black people getting good jobs straight out of high school. I'm talking about good paying union jobs, making good money from the 60s to the 70s. Then when the 70s hit, all of a sudden everything just stopped. Especially for Black men, it just disappeared. The jobs just dried up, and it's been like that ever since. So here we go, back to the story. In the wake of several federal reforms, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in employment and created an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, this helped shrink the difference between the median incomes of black and white families during that time. That's from the 60s to the 70s. Also, a broadening of federal minimum wage coverage to agriculture, restaurants, nursing homes, and other services where nearly a third of black workers were employed, helped narrow the earnings gap between black and white Americans during that period. And that was a research of the Act, the 1966 Fair Labor Standards Act. After that, the divide widened again as black Americans lost ground. Researchers point to a variety of factors to explain the reversal, including a weakening in federal efforts to combat structural racism and a decline in unionization. All the union jobs disappeared, as well as an increase in the number of families headed by single black mothers and incarceration rates of black men. I'm going to read that again. As the disparities increased in the number of families headed by single black mothers and the incarceration rates of black men. And while black Americans have acquired more education, they are still underrepresented in higher skilled, better paying jobs. By 2019, the average earnings ratio between black and white Americans had fallen back to where it was in the 1970s for both men and women, according to the analysis. And we have failed to change the mechanism by which we reproduce wealth, by which we reproduce skills, by which we reproduce market outcomes, and it's race related. So, you know, you have a one area where racial gap has shrunk over the last 5 decades is poverty. In 1970, there were nearly 4 times as many non-Hispanic black Americans in poverty as non-Hispanic white Americans. In 2019, the ratio dropped from 4 times down to 2.6. More consistent narrowing of the divide began in the 1990s, a period of economic prosperity and hot labor market. Also, some government programs for low and moderate income Americans, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, were adjusted to make work more attractive. In Congress overhauled welfare in 1996, reducing assistance to families and prioritizing employment. That's when they changed the welfare laws back in 1996. So, the trend continued even during the 2008 crisis, which increased financial distress among all Americans. And in recent years, still roughly one in five black Americans are living in poverty. Now, while that has come down a lot over the past 50 years, it's still shockingly high. It's a shockingly high number. I mean, extremely high number of poverty people on the poverty level. So another area where the gap between the races is narrowing is the share of each group who is employed. The difference has been cut nearly in half. This is what I'm saying. The difference in employment has been cut nearly in half since 1972. Though all of the improvement has been made in this decade, which saw steady job growth until the coronavirus pandemic struck in March. In tight labor markets, African Americans who have been previously excluded are now gaining employment. And that's those jobs nobody wants out there, like giving those coronavirus tests and stuff like that. Those service jobs, working in restaurants during the middle of the coronavirus, those jobs that people walked away from, or the jobs they never went back to for obvious reasons, because this dangerously exposes you to it puts you on the front line. Black Americans are typically more subject to the whims of the economy than their white peers. So the percentage of blacks who are employed drops more than the share of whites with jobs. And when the market improves, white Americans are the first to get hired. Until the outbreak, unemployment had been at or near 50%, 50-year lows for several months up until the outbreak. Still, Problems have plagued black Americans for decades persist. Ongoing hiring discrimination has kept black jobless rate at or above twice the unemployment rate for whites at much the same time. And the gains in employment population ratio does not show what types of jobs black Americans have landed, which are disproportionately low-wage positions that lack benefits. That's one reason why they've been hit hard by the coronavirus. And so the positive era still had underlying issues, which this pandemic made clear. So the pandemic has just opened up those gaps even wider, because now those good-paying jobs that are there, the white people getting those good, high-paying jobs, and as the economy tries to ramp back up, and black people are getting the short end of the stick once again. And we got six charts. Got 6 charts here. The U.S. black-white inequality in 6 stark charts. And along with the coronavirus pandemic, this was a proportionally killed black Americans has drawn renewed attention to the persistent inequities in wealth, health, and opportunity between blacks and whites despite economic prosperity of recent years. These disparities exist because of a long history of policies that excluded and exploited black Americans. Racial inequality has become so normalized in this society, it's what we expect to see. That's the way it's been for so long, and the numbers are staggering. First one is wealth. White families have substantially more wealth than black families. And the median net worth of white households is about 10 times the median wealth of black families. 10 times. Income. White families typically have higher incomes than black families. The median income of black households is less than 60% of the white households. And unemployment. The unemployment rate for black Americans exceeds that of whites. 16.7% for blacks and 14.2% for whites. And then you have the poverty level. A larger share of black population lives in poverty. So you got 20% of black people in America live in poverty, compared to 8.1% of whites that live in poverty in the United States. This is as of today. And the health care. A larger share of black Americans lack health insurance compared to whites. The current pandemic has also laid bare the inequities of the nation's health care system. One reason why black Americans have been hit harder is because they are less likely to have health insurance. And the coronavirus and the black people make up a large share of the U.S. COVID-19 deaths. Of the population, 13%. We're 13% of the population. However, we make up 23% of the coronavirus deaths in the United States. And so, hey, it's a sad situation. And if these conditions contribute to the making the coronavirus pandemic all the more deadly for blacks than for non-Hispanic whites, who account for more than 60% of the population, but only 53% of the deaths from this virus. So we got a lot of disparities that are jumping off in this United States, and it's like this is the United States wealth gap, the wealth gap, and the inequalities gap in the United States. And it's time for a change, folks. It's time to do better.
KP's Video News. It's KP's Video News, y'all.
That's right, it's KP's Video News, y'all.
KP's Video News, y'all.
Peace.